So, I have just finished reading another classic science fiction. Just finished, so this is by way of being a first impressions, first thoughts. The book is, as the thumbnail suggests, The Dancer from Atlantis by Poul Anderson. As you can see, this isn't the first time I've read this book by any means. I think the first time I read it was in my early teens when I was in my big class, what we called then fantasy and science fiction phase. These days it'd be classic science fiction. This book was probably like 15th hand when I bought it, and it suffered by travelling around all the years. At this last reading, part of it actually detached. So it's not the first of my books to do that, no shock. Okay, so Poul Anderson, I just read a few of his books, and I googled a couple of things about him while I was reading them, and during those googlings I kept coming up against the fact that a lot of sites claimed that The Dancer from Atlantis was one of Poul Anderson's most famous, most well-known, most generically recognised books, and I was a bit surprised every time. Poul Anderson was a Hugo and Nebula Award winner and lots of other things. I don't think this book won any prizes. I think it had a nomination for one of the mythic or time travel-y type awards, but I don't think it ever won anything. Still, everyone's saying that it's the most well-known, etc., blah blah blah. I just thought it was time to reread it. Reread it is in a big way. So the first time I would have read this, I would have been in my early teens, but I know I've read this particular copy at least twice since then, and now this time. I have never reviewed it online, and I've never remembered it very well from time to time. I have, however, kept the book with me, and I have kept rereading it, so that's a good sign. Now, on this rereading, however many times it is, I had to come to the conclusion that this book is actually, well, whether it's best known or not, it is deeply and profoundly, emphatically okay. And that's the best you can really say about it. It's not a bad book. There's a lot that's good about it, but it's still okay. The characters are fine. The writing is at times quite beautiful, but what I found during reading it is that I had a tolerance of about 2 or 3 pages at a time, and then I just sort of put it down and my brain would wander off to other things. When I wasn't reading it, I didn't burn to be reading it. During the reading experience, I never had the urge to stay up for all night until I'd finished it. That's also unusual for me. Reading 2 or 3 pages at a time, I'm more of a 2 or 3 hours at a time reader, not 2 or 3 pages at a time reader. So there was nothing bad about this book except that it failed to keep my attention, and it was just deeply, profoundly okay. It's not a big book. This copy has 170 pages. I'd normally go through that in one day, maybe 2. This one's taken me days. And it wasn't because I was terribly busy either. I was reading it throughout the day. I just never read it for very long at a time. Still, there's a lot here, as the kids would say. There's a lot to unpack about this one. And since it's from 1972, I don't think you can spoiler it. I'm not going to bother about even starting to worry about spoilers. So here goes. First chapter, we start with Duncan Reed, who is a middle-class, middle-aged American in 1970, standing on the board of a ship with which he's cruising with his wife, and he's standing there staring into night, thinking about things, and then the vortex seized him, and he is swept away. Chapter 2, we start with, this is arguably my favourite character, Oleg Vladimirovich, who is talking about boat passage in what's today Western Russia or the Eastern Bloc, and he's talking about how the passages become easier. He's talking about the politics since the Pechengs were vanquished, how it's easier to travel. Oleg is hereafter referred to as Russian, which made me think, one of the periods of history that I actually do know better is the Viking era, the part of the Viking era that went Varengoi to the Byzantine Empire. I've read quite a bit about the Byzantine Empire recently, and I at first contested describing him as Russian. He's from Novgorod, which I can't pronounce probably correctly, and I thought that in that era, so we're talking 1,000 years before 1970, because no spoilers again. You go by 1,000 increments at first. I would have thought that at that stage they would have been Kievan Rus, or they may even have still thought of themselves as Scandinavian. Anyway, we'll get back to that history later. There's quite a decent section here, and for the 2 or 3 pages that are dedicated to it, that sets up the scene and introduces Oleg beautifully. I really enjoy that. And then the vortex took him. So we go back another 1,000 years to Alden. Alden thinks of himself as being a Hun. He lives on the steeps. He's riding his horse somewhere with his full kit. 1,000 years before Oleg. And then the vortex took him. And we skip across to Erisa. Erisa's the only woman really in this book, and I found her introduction very interesting, and it was definitely the longest of them all. She is living in what is clearly a Mediterranean style era in a pre-Christian style time, because it's very pagan goddess worship based. It talks about sacred bulls, so you can set it in time a little bit. And there's a hint there, isn't there? Maybe she's in Atlantis. Atlantis isn't used as a word at that point, however. However, we learn a lot about Erisa, and then the vortex takes her. And all 4 of them end up dumped on this arid shoreline of the sea. It's a desert, and of course they can't talk to each other. So Duncan Reid, has the technological guy, is sort of like the go-to of knowledge, and he's kind of our main character. For large portions of these books, he's his only character. Because even though we've had beautiful introductions to all 4, I think we get at around about page 90, we're only really hearing Reid. He is our main voice. He's the only voice, and he isn't terribly interesting. He's not bad. He's okay. Anyway, they're on this shore, and they discover a glowing craft which Reid identifies as futuristic. There's 2 glowing helmets. They put them on each other's heads, and they can talk each other's language. That is the time travel sequence that explains how they get there. The time travel in this book is actually fairly minimal. You've got a tiny bit at the beginning, you've got a tiny bit at the end that explains the process, and all the rest is Reid and his friends back in time, which is also okay. It's not bad. And it fits in with the story, so yeah, it's okay. Once they can all speak to each other, things happen, they're all picked up, they're taken back to Athens, but this is an Athens of long ago. This is an Athens where Atlantis is still the dominant power, is a dominant power in the region. There is a lot of history in this book. I have a feeling that in my teens, when I wasn't really terribly into history, this book and other science fiction books like it are probably why, as an adult, I've become fascinated by history. And the history is incredibly well researched and incredibly well written. The descriptions of the ships, the descriptions of the anachronisms of the Huns' horse equipment, the anachronisms of ships, how they worked, the buildings, the society, all of that is incredibly well researched. Now, my acquaintance with Mediterranean cultures of the era is not high. It's higher than it would have been when I first read this book, because when I was in my late teens, I actually got to visit in Greece and Cyprus, was it? Anyway, I was the only one in our group of 17 and 18-year-olds who actually enjoyed the museums, lingered over the exhibits. I'd like to go back one day and actually linger for as long as I liked. Most of the others were bored. So the Mediterranean, the history descriptions are great, and clearly that is the thing that Poul Anderson was really most interested in exploring here, because there's some deviations from what is known to be true, He's obviously read a lot. There's actually about Mary Renault. I haven't read any Mary Renault when it comes to Mediterranean cultures. I've only read her Alexander the Great books, which were wonderful. But she's known as a bit of an icon in the field. When Poul Anderson mentions her theory here, it's a theory that Duncan Reid knows about. She apparently theorized that the bulls that were danced with by the bull dancers as the Minean cult were bred specially for being calm temperament, and he's contesting it here. Fair enough. You read history, you write a science fiction book, you contest the challenges, that's okay. I didn't know enough about the Mediterranean history of the era to be certain whether it was true or not true. Also, that's okay. It's one way to spark your interest, so you go and read the things. It sparked my interest to go back and read a little bit more about the Kievan Rus colonization of what's now Russia. A lot of Russians contest the received information that archaeologists accept because they're from a nationalistic point of view, but it's generally accepted that a lot of the area between Scandinavia and Byzantium was basically a Viking or Northlander outpost. So Norway, what's not today Norway or Sweden, they sent a lot of people on Viking expeditions and they colonized. I was actually reading a paper just this morning by a historian, I think it was the Polish historian, who's talking about, he wasn't talking specifically about the Kievan Rus and the colonization, he was talking about boats and portage in the region from the 900s to the 1000s. And as a background, he talked about the colonization of the Vikings of the era and how they established families, that there were findings that clearly indicate that they brought women and families along, and the establishment of the cities, and how in later times, so we're talking about the 10s, 1100s, they were called back to settle the peace. Again, some people contest that information. Anyway, okay. So I'll leave that for one of the books that are actually about Byzantium or the Kievan Rus. Now, with this one, you spend a lot of time dwelling on the history because it's all set in the history, and because, while the characters are okay, they are deeply okay. Duncan Reid, you get a lot of him. You don't get a lot of Ulden. That's the Hun. I've forgotten his name already. Around about page 132, I got a aha moment. That's why Ulden's character has been barely developed and we've seen almost nothing of him. He's basically a plot device rather than a person. That proved to be true. Erisa, who was a very excellent character to begin with, a strong woman from a culture which isn't heavily patriarchal, with a lot of autonomy because she was a priestess. Around about page 79 or 80, she got to start performing as a more active female character. As active female characters go, I've got to say he didn't do a bad job here. It was pretty okay. She has moments where she's actually the main actor and the motivator, the text and actions, in fact more than Duncan Reid, who just sort of swims along doing nothing very much except be the person through whom we see the story. Which is okay, because it's that sort of a story. There is also a point at page 90 when the author gave up all pretense of having other characters and just stuck to Duncan Reid for a long time. The other ones come back at the end. Now, going into this book, you know that Erisa'S motivation is, if possible, to spare her culture being taken over by Knossos, I think it is. A thing that we know in history happened after certain fires and destruction, which in this book Poul Anderson hypothesizes as being the fall of Atlantis. That's one of the locations that Atlantis has been theorized being in the Mediterranean and eradicated due to a volcano. That's the notion he's going with here. I don't know if that's still one of the primary contenders for most likely. I don't follow Atlantean theories and debates that much. So Erisa wants to save as many of her people. and definitely her younger self. Because, plot twist, in that last jump, instead of skipping back 1,000 years like they did for the three guys, the time travel capsule, which was already malfunctioning, was breaking heavily, and they've catapulted 20 years back into the past. And Erisa knew who Duncan was. She thought he was a god, and she thought she'd had a relationship with him, and she thought that Duncan was actually the father of her son. And how all of those things could come about was because, being only 20 or so years in the past, the younger Erisa, as well as the older time-travelling Erisa, both become factors of the story. Which could be really exciting, but it was okay. And the descriptions of the Mediterranean culture could have been wonderful. They could have been magnificent. They had all the hallmarks. Poul Anderson can describe scenes really, really well. But you only get the most fleeting descriptions, like a sentence or two, or maybe a whole string of characteristics of what something is. You never feel like these places are developed. The people certainly are not developed. It just is okay, and I feel like it could have been such a better book. There are so many people who have reviewed this as 4 or 5 stars, and I think what they are bringing to the story is a lot of them. I think they have fleshed out the extras, and that might be why I could only manage a page or two at a time. You'd read a section, a paragraph that should really have been several pages worth of action, people, events, descriptions, scenarios, and then you have to go away and think about it because the author hasn't actually done his job. This is a deeply okay book. If you like science fiction, classic science fiction at least, you will probably enjoy it. For the female character, people who don't like all classical science fiction because it does tend to be a bit patriarchy, that you probably not mind this one. The Dancer from Atlantis is a good character and she has a pretty major role. If you are deeply interested in the history of the Mediterranean or in the Atlantis theories, I think you can get a lot out of this. So, and if you've got a reading list for science fiction that includes time travel, this will tick a box. It won't be as fast to read as you think it will be, probably. It's an okay book. I'm glad I reread it. I am very glad I am reviewing it. Reviewing it means that maybe I'll actually remember it, because for a book that I've been reading for decades, I couldn't have named you one character, and I had a very misty idea of events. I knew there was time travel in there somewhere, but that was all I could have told you. I remembered almost none of the descriptions, and I've just finished it, and I'm already getting hazy on the politics. It doesn't help that all the names are in ancient Greek and I can't pronounce any of them. But a deeply okay book. I'd love to hear from people who didn't enjoy it, actually. You can tell me why. I want to know why other people didn't enjoy it. If you enjoyed it, you can comment and say I'm completely wrong. I'm good with it. If you have questions about it, by all means ask me, so comment in some shape or fashion.